At Credo, the clergy wellness program I recently attended, one of our central tasks was to review and update our rules of life. For those who have not heard of such a thing, a rule of life is intended to help bring balance into our lives through practices that deepen our awareness of God's love for us, shared in community, and lived out in our day-to-day lives. With its roots in what is known as the Rule of St. Benedict, these practices are meant to intentionally order our lives by prioritizing those things important to our spiritual, physical, and relational health. When one begins to develop their first rule of life, it is often much like writing out New Year's resolutions. I will study Scripture this much daily. I will exercise this much weekly. I will spend regular time with God in worship and with family and friends in fellowship. We all know what happens to those type of resolutions, don't we? Made with the best of intentions, they often fall by the wayside. Why? Because the change we are trying to make is so different from where we begin. We just can't break those daily routines that are already in place. And once we miss doing this, doing that, we readjust our practices to fit our life instead of reordering our life to fit our practices. And therein lies the problem. We cannot make a change unless we are prepared to do so, and that we are willing to make it. We may have the desire, we may even see the need for such change, but until we must make a change, our success in doing so is spotty at best. Take, for instance, our parish strategic plan. We spent years working on this to figure out exactly what it is we needed to do to enhance the spiritual, physical, and relational wellness of our parish. And when it was finished, we celebrated, we patted ourselves on the back. And we decided and made steps to begin living into that plan. Learning very quickly, doing so which is much harder than we expected. Like so many rules of life, so many New Year's resolutions, our wonderful ideas and plans, all made with the best of intentions, sit on a shelf, gathering dust. So Credo challenged us to take our personal rules of life off that shelf where they have been gathering dust and reevaluate their applicability and their feasibility. I was embarrassed to see that the last rule of life I developed with such great passion was so specific in nature, containing unrealistic goals that would have only been doable if I was not in full-time ministry, now sat on my shelf, gathering dust. And using the pre-programmed materials they sent me, I dreaded spending time developing something that I knew would meet their requirements, not mine, and once again be sitting on a shelf, gathering dust. As I packed, preparing for my trip, I looked over my bookcases for something to read on the airplane. And I ran across this book that I honestly had never remembered being on my bookcase. Obviously, it was there within some 2,000 books. I just never noticed it before. Seeing that it wasn't terribly long, And that when I read the synopsis on the back of the book, it didn't sound like it contained any deep theological insights that I had to unpack while I was gone. I grabbed it and threw it in my backpack. And getting on the airplane that morning, I began reading it and found myself drawn deeply into this man's story. And then about a third of the way through the book, it hit me. This was a story about developing a rule of life. I'm not sure that's what the author intended, but that is what that book spoke to me about. And it made the task of examining my rule of life during Credo something that makes sense, maybe even doable. And it also helped me to see that any rule of life to succeed must begin where we are, not where we want to be. I think that's something we hear in today's readings too. In St. John's Gospel account, Jesus is preparing his disciples for his departure. He knows that he must help them build their own rule of life that will enable them, not limit them, in their efforts to share the good news of God's grace and love once he is gone. So he begins where they are, in community, giving them a task he knows is doable, telling them, love one another. Love one another as he has loved them. And the love he's talking about is not that mushy kind of love we often think about between two people, but a love that sees in one another our true nature as beloved children of God. A love that reminds us that because of who we are, we have a responsibility to and for one another. Here's the thing. Jesus goes on to tell them that this love does not separate them from the world, but is what binds them to the world. Meaning that this love is not for them alone, but for all who would receive it. Their job was to make it known. Now that's another aspect of a rule of life. If there's not an overall goal, then the practices don't make sense. If we don't know why we are doing what we are doing, then when we stop doing it, it doesn't make any difference. So for the disciples, Jesus begins not by telling them what they are supposed to do, but why it matters. And in this case, in loving one another, doing so bears witness to the power of God's love to change lives and offer hope even in the midst of despair. Funny thing is, I was formulating my rule of life. This commandment, this reading, is what came to mind and gave purpose to the practices that were tugging at my heart. To love one another. To love one another, as I said earlier, is to see in one another who we really are as the beloved children of God. And seeing and knowing demands more than just acknowledging. It requires some form of intentional affirmation. In other words, just saying, well, we love each other, simply ain't good enough, folks. We must share that love for it to be real. Treating one another as the beloved children of God we are. This means setting aside our differences. Remembering that in community, it's not always about me first. That we are called to work together to bear witness to the change and hope God's love offers all who would receive it. If to love is our overall goal, then the ways in which we show that love help define those practices, those ways we bring into our rule of life. Ways that originate from where we are, not where we aspire to be. For me, it was to engage people with a more gracious heart, to forgive, even when I feel I have been the one wrong, and to seek God's wisdom, not my own sense of right and wrong, to know when I have fallen short. Folks, I'm here to say that change doesn't happen like that, just because we want it to. Not long after returning, I was in a conversation with someone, and another person uninvitedly shares their opinion about what they heard, causing me a little irritation. I see smiles. You've all been there. And while my response was tempted, I wondered, what should my response be? And the answer came to me. Forgive. Forgive them. Forgive myself. Forgiving ourselves is the hard part sometimes. And forgiving them can be hard if we don't recognize them as children of God. Because if we don't let go of that irritation, it can fester and damage and hurt our relationships. If we are able to love in this way, maybe we would find fewer times when we feel like we're the ones turning our cheek. And fewer times when we find ourselves causing others to feel that way because of our actions. To love in community does not mean we sit around singing Kumbaya, as some might argue. It means working together, bearing witness to the changes and hope God's love can make in our lives so that others might know it too. In this way, we will live more fully into the ministry that we share. A ministry we have posted on the wall in the parish hall. To be a place where people meet Christ and grow in their relationship with God through our worship, our service, and our fellowship. Amen.